Welcome, everybody. This is my series called COVID Perspectives, where I invite a guest each week to provide their views and insights and share their experiences of the pandemic. And this week, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Sally Witcher, OBE. And, well, I could talk for a long time about the CV of Dr. Sally Witcher because she has got such an impressive track record of CEO of Child Poverty Action Group and chair of Disability Employment Advisory Committee and an advisor to the Scottish Government, and with a new initiative as well. Dr. Sally Witcher, welcome to the program. Hi.
All right, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here and wonderful opportunity to say a few things. So yeah, great. Thanks a lot.
And Gemma, do you want to say hi to people and let them know how we like to run the spaces?
Yeah, nice to see everybody again, and I know people will probably be filtering in, so appreciate everybody who's both in the COVID cautious, long COVID, and just generally aware communities. We'll go through about an hour with Dr. Witcher, and then at which point we'll get to some questions, and we'll pull speakers up using hand format, and if you could be considerate with your time, conscious of your question, so that we could have a little dialogue. We appreciate that. And so, yeah, nice to see everybody.
Thanks, Gemma. Now, by agreement beforehand, I spoke to Dr. Witcher about with this less formal arrangement, whether it would be appropriate to refer to her as Sally from here on, and that was agreed. So, Sally, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
Right. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Well, where do I start? As you said, I've had in some ways quite an odd career path because I started off with fine art, making sculpture, and somehow moved into voluntary sector, and then went over to be a senior civil servant, and I've chaired government. I mean, I've done all kinds of things. I've been involved in academia with the London School of Economics and goodness knows what. But anyway, I think the other thing, possibly the most important thing in some ways to say about me, is that I'm a disabled person. I've been disabled since early childhood. I'm a wheelchair user. And I'm also at high risk still from COVID due to an impressive collection of ailments I've acquired over the years. And so when COVID struck, I kind of realized I'd somehow gone and acquired a new impairment in the form of risk. And so whilst I was well used to being discriminated against as a visibly disabled wheelchair user, I was now going to be experiencing the gaslighting that people with invisible impairments often have to deal with too. So, it's this kind of a strange combination, I think, of a kind of being in senior roles, but as a disabled person with a lot of lived experience of discrimination. And it's really grounding because you can't kind of start to feel too self-important, because sooner or later, usually pretty quickly, a taxi driver will ask your PA, where does she want to go? And does she want the ramp? You might have just been talking to a parliamentary committee, but you're going to be brought down to earth pretty fast. But it also means that I kind of am absolutely passionately committed to the importance of people with lived experience and our experience, saying what needs to happen, because you only really understand what the barriers are if you live them. And so it's about, in some ways, I suppose what I'm doing now is what I've always done. It's about trying to find ways to channel anger constructively to bring about positive change, and trying that in lots of different ways, and trying to do it with and learn from a lot of different people, and understand different perspectives.
Thank you, Sally. I mean, I was reading an article that you were involved with, and you said that, in some cases, the moving of boundaries has consequences so extreme that you're hard to think of an example of a greater avoidable inequality and exclusion than we're currently experiencing. And that would apply to people who are disabled. It would apply to people like Jama, who is, now really trying to avoid COVID because he's got long COVID. How do we, like you say, you will have experienced these boundaries for your whole lifetime. How do you go about trying to break these boundaries? What's your approach been over your life?
Well, I think the big sort of change came for me. I mean, as somebody who had, for a lot of my younger days, rejected identifying as a disabled person, kind of waking up to the fact that actually it wasn't necessarily my impairment that was disabling me. It was things like other people's attitudes towards me, towards things like environments that were inaccessible or now these days unsafe. Things like not having access to good communication or accessible communication and information, and inaccessible transport, and again now like unsafe transport. So it's about understanding that it isn't all about your situation. It's not you that is the problem here. It isn't that people who are clinically vulnerable are in fact clinically vulnerable very often. It's because they're kind of made clinically vulnerable because it's about exposure risk. It's about if you change the environment, you make the environment safe, then you may be at clinically high risk, but you're not necessarily going to, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to be able to go places. And if you're not able to work every day, well, it isn't necessarily going to stop you working. It depends on how employment is structured. So I think it's about trying to change the mindset. It's about trying to see it doesn't stop you being disabled. It doesn't stop you having energy impairment. It doesn't stop any of that, and that's always going to be challenging. Healthcare is always going to have a very important role, but it's also about understanding that's not in any way the full story, and it's these other things, these external things. If you change people's attitudes, if you change the environment, if you give people good information, then in many cases that kind of does away with that exclusion. So that I think is where I started. It was that almost like sort of understanding it's not us that are the problem here, and it's not down to us to solve it. So if people are having, I saw a survey the other day about better mental health support for people who are immunocompromised, and that's important. But it's also about how do you stop governments and society putting intolerable pressure on people who are immunocompromised by depriving them of things that would mean that they would have much more freedom and safety, and so that their mental health isn't put under such pressure in the first place. I don't know if that helps explain, but I think that's kind of, if you like, my way into how to tackle some of this stuff. And so that's kind of where my thinking, as I said, a lot of this stuff is things I kind of knew already. It took me a while to work out that actually a lot of the learning I had as an individual disabled person, but also working in that kind of area, it kind of almost gave me a head start with this situation. It obviously isn't quite the same, but an awful lot of the learning I already had from that environment, from that kind of sector, was absolutely relevant. And, I hope that's something that I can, pass on to people, but also learn from other people. As I say, I've been very lucky in my career to meet and all kinds of people in all different roles and perspectives, and you just learn so much that way. And being able to sort of see things from other people's perspectives. I mean, it might look perfectly obvious from where you are that this should happen, but from somebody else's perspective that you can't possibly know about, it's impossible for good reasons. You've got to kind of have that dialogue. You've got to talk. You've got to find ways that work for everyone as well as possible.
Yeah, and I noticed something that you wrote where you said, we face a tide of public indifference, and I love that phrase. That is absolutely where we are. But if I might draw a parallel between what you've just said, it's like you're being able to get access to buildings and transport and different ways of communicating. They're liberating. They enable you to be more part of society more easily. And really, that's kind of what we're saying with protections and cleaner air, is that allows people who, for one reason or another, wish to avoid this infection. It allows us to take part more freely as well. Is that the correct parallel, would you say?
Absolutely, yes. It's about, in a way, there are things you can do to build your own, to build your personal resilience, and your clinical resilience, and that's about vaccination and antivirals and so on, if you can get them, because actually, despite my many impairments and extreme high risk, I'm not eligible for quite a lot of that stuff, and a lot of people aren't, certainly in the UK. But it's also about understanding it. That's part of what you do. It's about, if you like, adjusting the person to build their resilience, and then it's also about adjusting how society operates, so that it accommodates people who are at high risk or disabled. And it's how you deal with both of those two parts of the jigsaw, if you like, to get the best possible fit. I don't know if that explains it.
Yeah, I mean, another line that you came out with in this article was that the COVID has caused a new societal fault line.
Yes.
And I really think those two phrases, a tide of public indifference and a new societal fault line, they really struck a chord with me, because I feel it. I feel exactly that way.
Yes.
And I mean, what I've noticed that what I wanted to talk to you about is this new idea that you've got for an inclusive new normal. This is your new project. Tell us more about how did inclusive new normal arise?
Well, I suppose it started, I don't know, let me think, where did it start? It started really when I was in the relatively early days of the pandemic, when I was the chief executive of an organisation called Inclusion Scotland. And that's an organisation of, as opposed to for disabled people, so led by disabled people. And they did a survey, we did a survey, and it was in the first few months of the pandemic, to try and find out, well, how things were for disabled people. And it kind of come as a surprise to nobody that things were absolutely dire for disabled people, because on top of everything else, a lot of sort of social care and other sorts of services were, well, falling apart, basically. But what was also very interesting about those days was that suddenly all these sort of things that we'd been told for decades were not possible, such as remote working from home, suddenly were possible. And amidst all the people who were talking about the terrible and truly terrible situations they were in, there was one or two going, "This is great. It's brilliant. I've been stuck in my house for years, not being able to see anyone, meet my pals, do courses, and now I can do it all online." And it was this sort of realization that somehow, well, first of all, as I've known, change, it doesn't have to be this way, change is possible, and it kind of proved that. And once the majority were affected, certainly things that hadn't been possible became possible very quickly. But it was about seeing how the boundaries between inclusion and exclusion were kind of being redrawn, in some cases in positive ways as well as negative. So that was kind of a start. But then I kind of, being stuck in my house, and I still do go out very rarely because it isn't safe, and it's in some ways even less safe because all protections have basically gone out the window. People are getting sick all the time and just sort of, I don't know, taking that as the new normal. But, I was kind of, I think, like a lot of people after, a long period of this, and I just sort of was spiraling downwards. It was this sense of, well, this is my life, that, all the things I was doing, was out there, out and about the whole time. I was chairing an advisory commission for the Scottish Government. I was off for meetings, I was speaking at conferences. That had all gone. And I wasn't going to be able to do a lot of that, and I was stuck in by myself. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will kind of have been through similar kinds of stuff. And I just thought, hang on a minute, whoa. I've kind of lost confidence in what governments are going to do. I mean, it was hard because Scottish Government in particular made such a big deal of equality and human rights. It still does, but it's clearly doing absolutely nothing about it whatsoever. And I just started thinking, well, what would be good? What would work? And I met up with some people online. I think I'd been to some online event, just happened upon. And it was a bunch of people called COVID Action Scotland. And, it was just a bunch of people I'd never met in actual person. And they were just such fantastic support. But I also started learning about things, clean air and FFP3, or N95 type masks, and we're starting to think, well, there are things that could be done and they're not being done. So what would a safe, inclusive new normal actually look like? What would it need? So I started trying to think that through, and I wrote a sort of strategy. Well, and then I had to go tweeting it, which was an interesting experience. I never tweeted a strategy before. And to my amazement, it got a really positive response. It even got media interest. And I even got a meeting with the minister off the back of it. And so I started thinking, oh, maybe I'm onto something here, So this, I want to follow this through. And it also helped me as soon as I started thinking about, well, okay, this is terrible, but actually, start thinking about what could be done positively, what things that are realistic, could be done. It kind of got me out of it, and I started to feel much better and more positive. And yeah, so that's where it started.
Yes, but I think you probably feel were feeling, and probably still do, like many of us here in this room, isolated, marginalized, forgotten. And I mean, to the point where you were working as an advisor for the Scottish Government, and you actually resigned, didn't you, so that you could be more outspoken about this?
I did. I was chairing this body called it was the Scottish Commission on Social Security. So it was basically a small body charged with scrutinising devolved social security regulations. So very complex stuff, both in terms of the technical, whether it was actually going to work and fit with other regulations and law, including the Social Security that wasn't reserved. But one of the things we had to do was to see whether the legislation, the draft regulations, conform to human rights. So I was sort of started to think, well, hang on a minute, here I am, and there was some great stuff happening around Social Security in Scotland. But I started thinking, this is really tricky. First off, I'm here scrutinising against human rights, whilst my own are being trashed. This is feeling problematic. And also that, I don't know, as a public appointee, which is what I was, you're quite constrained in terms of what you can do, and rightly so, actually, because it's very important. the body you chair has credibility across the political spectrum, and that what you're doing does not jeopardize the important work of that body. So I think that's right. I'm not disputing that, but I really needed to be talking about what was being done or not done on COVID by the same government, and could see scope for confusion. And indeed, that was pretty much, literally a few weeks after I resigned, I'd managed to get in front of the COVID-19 Recovery Committee in a personal capacity, and I was introduced as the chair of the Scottish Commission on Social Security, which of course had nothing to do with COVID whatsoever. And I just thought, yeah, well, I made the right decision there, didn't I? For that reason as well, because I didn't want to be doing something that was going to undermine the important role of that committee and the actual good work the Scottish Government was doing on devolved social security. But I did want to be incredibly critical around what they were, around their mismanagement of the pandemic.
Yes, and I suppose it's a difficult choice, isn't it? Do you try to change things from the inside, or do you move away and see if you can influence things more from the outside? But if the other government ministers aren't listening, then I don't suppose you've really got much choice, have you? But to say, well, I've got to try. I've got to leave so that I can say what I need to say.
Yeah, the way I've always thought about it is that there are times when a government is basically or broadly going in the sort of direction you would like it to go in, and where they're going to be receptive to people who know about that area, and you can actually then have influence and impact. In which case, in that situation, it's worth getting in there and doing what you can to work with government to try and support it to do things that you think are a good idea, and they're willing to listen to you. Not necessarily do everything you say, but it's a meaningful kind of engagement. However, there are also times when that is an absolute waste of time because they're not receptive. They're really not going to do it. And worse, what happens if you're too close to a government that is basically doing things that you regard to be destructive, is that you become implicated. It becomes harder. You almost become sort of by association, almost like incorporated. And in that sort of scenario, I've always felt it's important to get further away from government. But where I can work constructive government, I always will. But it takes two to tango, doesn't it? And right now, the government, as far as COVID is concerned, isn't listening. And I needed to be more distant in order to, I think, have more influence, actually.
Yeah, and I think we probably both share the frustration of looking at governments who aren't talking about long COVID, and they aren't joining the dots with excess deaths, and they are only looking at acute infections, and it just doesn't make any sense to it, does it? But I just want to, so I've gone off track slightly. I wanted to get back to your inclusive new normal, and you'd written this, well, there was an article in the Herald, which is a Scottish newspaper, isn't it?
Yes.
Which talked about the manifesto that you're trying to get, because this is a social enterprise, isn't it, that you're setting up?
That's right. I was trying to think about how I could do something more than a few Twitter threads about this, even though that had an impact. I wanted to be doing, really building this. So I applied for some startup funding from an organisation in Scotland called Firstport, that provides a bit of startup money for new social enterprises. And a social enterprise, I'm not keen on charities as a concept. I prefer social enterprises because they're not for profit. Any profit you make goes back into the organisation, but it feels more equal. It's not the sense of doing good to the poor and needy, which I always feel is the charity model. So with that, it was enough to start things moving. I mean, just basics, get things set up. Like, you know, and I'm trying to, you know, working on a website at the moment and so on. So it's still really early days. And there's an awfully long way to go. But, you know, it's about, I was trying to find ways of structuring and expanding, because obviously since I first came up with this idea, all kinds of new stuff has happened. And I've also kind of learned so much more about innovations happening across the world, and just realized how much is going on, you know, incredibly valuable and exciting stuff that you just never get to hear about, and governments don't even know about here anyway. And there was just so much that needed to be done to kind of drive good practice to, and better products as well. You know, there's a lot of problem solving here, and that needs to be done. And so that's kind of the next step, if you like. I mean, it was a very clear vision, you know, a goal of a safe, inclusive new normal, in which everyone's freedom is maximised. And it's about the sorts of areas that I picked up on, around clean air. It's around, you know, obviously remote and hybrid. Because right now, I don't know if other people have experienced this, a lot of things went remote and hybrid, and they're now starting to roll back to in person. And I think that's profoundly against, you know, equality. And also there's the business case. There's this really strong business case, which somehow nobody's really kind of noticing. And it's also about, obviously, all the clinical developments. It's about equality and human rights, and it's about all kinds of other sorts of learning. You know, it's to do with, we've learned an awful lot about human behavior, and kind of, I have a feeling that some of the changes that have happened, we've hardly begun to explore where they could take us. I mean, seeing how, well, just look at what we're doing now. You know, here we are, people from, I have no idea where people are from all kinds of different countries, who are kind of able to talk, and to organise as well. And I think that's really exciting. I think it has, you know, huge implications. So that's kind of what I, you know, if you like, the vision, and some of the kinds of areas that I think, you know, need to be pushed harder and faster.
So, really, would you say that the starting point is with an information campaign? Because I think there's a real lack of education of even how this is spread. You know, just amongst the general public, they don't know, do they? Is that where we begin?
I think that's really important. I think it's also about engaging with people's genuine questions, you know, because I think people, sometimes what I've seen is governments don't answer, they don't engage with counter views. They don't, they just kind of go down their own track, and people generally don't know. And actually, people are generally very interested once you start talking to them. And I don't know how many times I've heard is kind of like, I didn't know that. Why don't I know that? Why are people not saying anything about this? Why is government not told us? Why is the media silent on this? And these are obviously extremely good questions. Yeah. So.
But somehow we have to, you know, look at human behavior and attitudes, and find ways in which we can stop people clinging to the familiar. I think is something that you've said.
It is, but I think it's about acknowledging trauma. You know, it's about working with people as people are, not as you would like them to be. And it's about taking, you know, not being afraid to engage with challenge. I mean, I've got no interest in, you know, wasting time talking to people who are not the slightest bit interested in actually doing anything or learning or rethinking. But I think a lot of people are receptive, and I think it's important that people be given very clear information. I think even things like research as well there's an issue there. I think there's some fantastic research out there, but you read, say, I don't know, a report in, say, Nature or even something like the Lancet or something, and your average person, and in fact including me, this is a foreign language, a lot of this stuff. And I kind of feel there's a need to translate some of this stuff so people can actually understand it, because otherwise it's wide open to misinterpretation and manipulation. And it's about people having a trusted place to go and to feel heard. So if people have got a genuine question about something, I really want to know what that is. It doesn't mean that I know the answer, but we've got to try and find out. We can't just. People are, I don't know. People are very angry. They're upset. It was a seismic shock to society, and a lot of what we're seeing doesn't make sense in all kinds of ways. And we have, as a species, I think, a need to form a narrative, a need to understand. And if we don't have good information, other people and governments and reputable sources are not going to join the dots or enable us to do that. Other people are going to do that. So you're absolutely right. Information is critical, but it has to be not just telling people stuff. It's about two-way dialogue. It's about really listening, and doing and trying to be receptive to perspectives that you don't understand, that you don't know about, and being ready to shift your position. I always say that my assessment of and my views on things are always provisional, subject to better data, better arguments coming along, and I kind of feel that's the stance we need to take. Otherwise, we just end up perpetuating this polarization that gets nobody nowhere, and just ends up with a whole divide and rule thing, which is really unconstructive and actually really detrimental to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, we